The fertility rates of Muslim population is declining faster. But that does not change things on the ground. Real concern is shares of population within a district.
Are you in favor of an NRC?
Oh, yes, I am.
You are?
No modern plural democracy can function without these basic institutions.
India's GDP is cause for concern. If we are going to grow into a slower growth in the first quarter of 2025, that's what is expected. Is it a hiccup or do you see a pattern emerging?
It's a hiccup. Our framework for inflation needs a readjustment. So you have seen the RBI, their inflation targets or the kind of impact that inflation has, they are extremely conservative.
Companies are spending less on R&D, one on research and development, and the other effect is the impact on salaries.
In many ways, our policy making has aspirationally, we think like OECD or the G7, but there has to be a pragmatism in terms of what is it that we can afford, not just from the government, also from the private sector.
All these schemes which are coming in, are they freebies? And if they are freebies, how long will our economy be able to sustain?
As far as a lot of the regional parties are concerned, they are not being innovative and creative enough. It's not that there aren't genuine issues. It's a large country with all kinds. But they are resorting to the kind of cheap politics, which is really ruining the state budgets.
Namaste, Jai Hind. You're watching or listening to another edition of the ANI podcast with Smita Prakash. Recently, the Chief Ministers of Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, Chandrababu Naidu and MK Stalin, set alarm bells ringing about the decline in population in the southern states. Both of them asked their people in their states to have more children. It became a source of mirth for some, but others realized the seriousness of what the two chief executives of the state were saying to their people. That two of the most prosperous states in the country were going to have aging populations and various other issues that come with it. This got people thinking. Then came the advice of the RSS chief Mohan Bhagwat for Indians to have 3 children. And then came this tweet by Elon Musk. He said that Singapore and many other countries are going to get extinct. He posted in response to an article discussing Singapore's baby crisis and the potential role of robots in mitigating the effects. But let's get back to the India story. Does it merit a policy intervention? To answer this, we have in the studio Dr. Shamika Ravi. Dr. Shamika Ravi is a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. She's published extensively in international peer-reviewed academic journals and writes regular opinion pieces in newspapers. We will speak to her about whether India needs to have a policy intervention to retain its demographic dividend. Another issue that we will discuss is that of foreign direct investment into India in the period between April 2000 to September 2024. That has soared to $1,033 billion mark. So does that mean that despite the negative articles in the foreign media that there is no confidence in the Indian economy, there is one? And we will also discuss the plummeting rupee to dollar ratio. Shamika, hi. Thank you so much for coming to the podcast. I should call you Dr. Shamika. This is a big mistake. I should call you Dr. Shamika Ravi. So, but may I have your permission in calling you by your first name?
Of course, Smita. Thank you so much. I'm going to call you by your first name.
Okay.
Thank you for the invitation.
So, we will get into this entire demographics and change and the change in the border areas. Chandrababu Naidu, Stalin and Mohan Bhagwat, all of them saying Indians should have more children. But I'm going to come and on this India's GDP. It's cause for concern. It slowed to 5.4% in July-September quarter of, and then it's below. I think the projection is 7%. Is it a sign of a systemic slowdown? What are the reasons behind it? And if we are going to grow into a slower growth in the first quarter of 2025, that's what is expected. Is it a hiccup or do you see a pattern emerging?
It's a hiccup. There is no pattern emerging. If you consider the fact that we had a major election which lasted a very long period. That does disrupt even government spending, and we have seen that in the form of model code of conduct which comes into play. So the spending pattern of the government itself gets slowed, right? Then of course, we, unlike many other parts of the emerging market, are more driven by domestic pressures. One thing which has happened is that, our framework for inflation needs a readjustment. So you have seen the RBI being extremely conservative, and their inflation targets, or the kind of impact that inflation has on their policy in terms of interest rate cuts, etc. They are extremely conservative. Some of that conservatism is also arising from the fact that our inflation has a very heavy weightage given to food. And it remains like that as far as the way we measure and the way things have. What has happened on the ground, though, as the recent NSSO data showed, that food as a share of consumption basket for an average Indian has actually shrunk. And in urban India, it's less than 40%. It's really 37 point something.
So Indians are spending less on food?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that has to now percolate down to the framework of the way we measure the inflation, which is CPI. That then goes into policy decisions of not just the RBI, but almost all big decisions, even in fiscal terms, right? So I think these are just processes which are underway.
Explain to me, why are Indians spending less on food? Is it because of the free food grains?
Yes. And I think this is where people don't understand when they often try and attack the 80 crore people getting free food grain as a bad thing. What has effectively happened, particularly after the pandemic, is there is a fiscalization of the food plate. Because your basic food grains like rice and wheat are, for a very large group of people, has been taken care of by the government. So the government is paying for that. The savings which you have on this has now shifted to fruits. You have had a 40% increase in food, and not just, by the way, spending, actual kilograms of eaten fruits, even for the poorest quintile. That's why these are remarkable changes that are happening in the economy. The biggest increases are happening in the most remote parts of the country.
Is this only city-based, Shamika, or is it across rural areas?
Across with every district, right? It's all across the country. Every state is seeing major surge. Big rise in consumption of fruits and vegetables, fruits in particular. Big rise in milk and milk product, eggs, fish and meat.
Okay.
Right? So these are great things. And
Pulses?
Pulses too. Proteins are also rising. The point, though, is that overall consumption of rice and wheat is falling because people are eating more of other things, non-carbs. And the spending is therefore reflected in that way.
So what happens? How does the agriculture sector get impacted because of consumption patterns changing? Or have they changed at all? I mean, if they're eating more fruit, they're not eating less grain.
Right.
That's also happening, right?
Well, they are eating less grain.
Oh, okay.
Smita, on an average, an average Indian per month is eating 2 kilogram less, fewer, than we did 10 years back.
Okay.
So that's a big decline, no? On an average, it was 11 kilogram, now it is 9.
Huh.
And this is not just for the richer 1 or 2 quintile. Even the poorest 20% are eating on an average 2 kilogram less of rice and wheat. They're eating more of these other things.
Okay.
Right? And that is getting impacted. It's wonderful for micronutrients, the health outcomes in terms of anemia, direct impact. Right?
Okay.
But that's one thing that we have measured. I'm sure there are multiple other. But from the fiscal side, if you're thinking about governance and what is it doing in terms of the public finance, we have produced a lot of rice and wheat. In fact, our production is overwhelmingly rice and wheat.
Our food security is also...
But that is the reason rice and wheat we began, because
Yeah.
food security has been.
Yeah.
But I think we have met those targets now. This is now, we are staring at a phase 2 or 3 perhaps of agriculture, where our biggest improvements in agriculture production has happened in fisheries or fruits and vegetables, right? So the production is also shifting.
Okay.
But the consumption is shifting much faster. And remember, the MSP regime is almost entirely based on food grains, right? So those shifts have to happen. And millets, we have made a significant headway. But that diversification, Smita, is happening on the ground. And that's why, the states which are agriculturally doing phenomenally well today. You look at MP, Bihar, Andhra Pradesh. And not because of rice and wheat, right? It's fish. Fisheries of Andhra have had significant growth, significant rise.
So you see diversification happening up north too? Or because policy has to change, right? The state governments have to encourage people on the ground to change because of consumption patterns changing.
Yes.
Do you see that happening in the northern states?
It's slower. So It is happening everywhere, right, in terms of consumption. What we have not measured right now is in terms of the production. I'm sure it is there, the data is there. I just haven't looked at it that way.
Okay.
But the production is shifting everywhere. Right? Throughout the country, we are seeing change in production. Meaning, an average Indian in every state of India today is consuming a much more diverse plate. Well, it used to be rice and wheat overwhelmingly. Now you're consuming all these non-rice and wheat.
So I'm going to jump from topic to topic. I know that viewers and listeners will get irritated, but there are so many things that I want to cover. The other thing which I want to ask you is about foreign direct investment flows into India. So is that there are various ways to look at it. Some say there's a flight of capital which has taken place. High net worth individuals are sending their children to live in Dubai, not live here because of the tax regime in this country. Some say that the negative articles that you're seeing in the foreign media, that gets reflected in Indian media, that was tilted because of an anti-Modi mindset that is there. Is FDI coming into India? If it is, which are the sectors, or is there an outflow? Are people running away? What's happening?
So, one thing structurally which we have struggled as a country for the last 10 years have been the private investment side of things, right? Because our growth has been overwhelmingly on the back of domestic demand and government spending. But that is also to be expected at this phase of growth because the government is mostly spending on core connectivity and infrastructure. These are like your basic core needs on which the economy then sort of grows, no? Digitalization and all of that jam, you should think of it not just in terms of physical infrastructure, but also the softer sort of the technical, digital connectivity, etc., are all part of core infrastructure. On the back of that, you are seeing domestic demand has picked up, but private investment relatively was slower to pick up. And I think that is where, Smita, we have to first think of what we inherited from the UPA2 was an extremely fragile banking system as a whole, but also general, I think, faith in money making or entrepreneurship, etc. There is a general sense in the society that businessmen are not honest, right? And therefore, the kind of needs, the kind of structural changes that have to be brought up, not just to clean up banks, but to really the whole ease of doing business and trying to get the government out and changing the perception, that takes time.
Yeah, if you did ease of business, which means you were a government which was supporting big business, which means you were getting kickbacks, which means crony capitalism.
Yes.
These were all, 8 degrees of separation or 7 degrees of separation. That's how it was viewed.
Yes.
I think it changed towards the early 2000s, or didn't it?
Well, it did, except UPA, I think during the UPA regime, many things happened. One is, if you think of the retrospective taxation, that was a big blow to private confidence. If you look at entrepreneurs in terms of what kind of confidence I have in institutions like courts, etc., that they will protect my property rights, right? That's why the recent change in the Supreme Court is also an important one, because we are finally saying that, look, retrospectively, we should avoid targeting or imposing any kind of tax, right? Then we had the coal allocations getting annulled after 18 years. Kahan hota hai aise? You see, these kind of things, these are long-term, major blow. Structurally, we get scared, spooked. And that takes time. So while the IBC and the cleaning of the banks and all of that, we saw institutions begin to emerge. But confidence building, particularly of the nature we are talking about, that takes time. Now, the thing is, all India numbers, when you see, you often forget that we have states which are doing phenomenally well. Because our CMs today, chief ministers today, have to also play the role of chief executives. They have to compete, not just globally, but they have to outcompete each other today in many ways to attract a lot of these FDIs.
Correct.
And so we are seeing that there are many states in our western and southern parts where manufacturing is beginning to blossom. Right? And industrialization and the building of an industrial society. So the entire thinking of economic policy is now moved sufficiently away from agriculture as the only source of some revenue. Now they are thinking mostly, policies that will help them industrialize faster. So that we are seeing. Many states have significant increases in their FDIs.
So you don't see any disillusionment in foreign investors with regard to the Indian economy?
No, I don't.
No.
And the reason is also, look, the global economy is also in turmoil. right? If you just look at the back end supply chain, the China-US trade
Post-COVID
wars,
also.
and then Trump, and there have been many shocks. But India has steadily had very sound fundamentals, right? And I think it's a young economy. It remains the fastest moving growing economy in the world. And almost always, if you look at the projections made by IMF, OECD, etc., they're always having to revise it only in one direction.
Yeah.
So, Smita, it tells you that we as a country, also in policy making from the fiscal side, we are a bit conservative. But I think many of the multilaterals, etc., are also, for whatever reasons and
bullish on
intentions,
India.
they, of course, in the long term, they're almost always bullish on India. That's why they're having to revise their forecasts and estimates always upwards.
Okay. Shamika, I want to ask you about R&D. With the growth rate slumping, companies are spending less on R&D. One, on research and development, and the other effect is the impact on salaries. Wage growth across many sectors have slumped as a result of that. So how should policymakers look at it, private and public? How both these things?
One thing historically we have to remember that we might have been one of the very few countries which established minimum law legislation even before we had any significant economic growth. Countries like Japan have had 100 years of economic growth before these kind of policies have been brought in.
Like
Right?
labor laws.
Labor laws, minimum wages. Right? So in many ways, our policy making has aspirationally, we think like OECD or the G7 because we want to have the benefits, and I think it's a good thing to push for it. But there has to be a pragmatism in terms of what is it that we can afford. Not just from the government, also from the private sector. Right? So one is the minimum law itself. The second is, of course, if you think of maternity benefits, right? We moved to 6 months.
Yeah.
And I think it's very progressive.
Even
but
America doesn't have that.
the US, in fact, ironically,
I know, 2
remains
weeks
the
or-
only country with minimal paid, right? But that's what markets get you. If you leave it only to the markets, and that's where there are market failures, and that is the role for government. That if you want to bring progressive policies, which is good for society and not just firms, you will have to bring in a shock, which is in the form of a policy. right?
Okay.
In terms of earnings right now, there is a huge variation across the sectors. Right? We are also seeing that there is a major surge in labor force participation of women. Right? You have a 69% increase in women labor force participation in rural areas from 17-18 to 22-23. Now imagine what a massive increase it is. So if you just look at the quantum of people now ready, willing to work, the wages are not going to, continue growing. So please think of this from a larger perspective of demand, supply of labor. And I'm looking at it, of course, from an overall economy point of view. Urban areas have relatively seen lesser, which is 25%. Anywhere else in the world, this is a big increase. But for India, these are still conservative number because the base remains small.
Also, what you were explaining to me is that, if there are women coming into the workforce, that means that there are two-income families now, even in tier 2 towns and cities, which we didn't. Maybe when you and I were growing up, it's usually you saw very, very few families where there were two-income families. Now it's almost the norm in cities. And in tier 2 towns, it's happening. So which means that with more women coming in the workforce, do they get equal pays? How is it impacting?
That discrimination continues, right? Empirically, if you see, there are differences between men and women for the same job. In fact, government remains the outlier here because you don't see differences in terms of men and women earnings. But private sector in many industries, you do see these kind of differences, particularly if you're thinking of lower and mid-level, right? Not at the senior level.
Does government, is there any need for government intervention in these kind of things? When women come into the workforce, when there is more diversity, what is the government intervention in this?
I think the big gorilla in the room as far as women and economy are concerned, it is what is happening to the family structure. You see, and this is where we have to have honest conversation. Women entering labor market and going out and working for a living also has an implicit cost, which is to the family, which is to childcare. If I just tell you on an average, an Indian woman of the working age of 18 to 59 spends 4 to 5 hours taking care of someone, elderly or children. And by the way, we have a lot of elderlies, 120 million people above the age of 60, and they also need care. Care is almost always entirely on the shoulders of women in the household. So when they are going out and working, this now cannot be in the household. You have to go out and buy it. That market has not evolved. Culturally also, are we ready to outsource activities of care? I think these are very difficult questions to answer.
But there has been, because of policy intervention by the government, for example, this Ladki Bahin
Yeah.
or Ladli Behna,
Yeah.
these things, it was surprising for us city kinds, who've had money, who have control over our own earnings. Most of us do. Not everybody, I need to say that. But when this money was coming into the hands, so when I spoke to women in Madhya Pradesh, when I spoke in Maharashtra, strange things. When that money came in, 1,000 rupees, in 2 months she was able to buy a cycle for her daughter.
Yeah.
Right? In 2 months
Yeah.
of that installment, she was
Yeah.
able to buy a cycle for her daughter. This daughter started going to school
Yeah.
because, she wouldn't get teased on the way
Yeah.
while
Yeah.
walking. She didn't have to take a bus.
Right.
She had her own private transport.
Right.
So she could go to school. That was in Madhya Pradesh. In Maharashtra, there are reporters who came around and said that the woman for the first time could buy a sari for herself.
Right.
Otherwise, she had to wait for a Diwali
Yeah, yeah.
to buy a sari.
Yeah.
And that also
These
was
are
given to
big.
her by her husband.
Yes, yes.
This is now a money which she has come and she has had the independence to
Yeah.
tell her husband कि मैं अपने पैसे से साड़ी ले रही हूँ अपने लिए. Now,
Yeah. That is one side of the story, and it's a wonderfully empowering story.
and like Piyush Goyal was saying once when he was on the podcast that, when the housing was done, where this,
It is mostly in the names of women.
so suddenly you're
Yeah.
seeing like, in
Major
one house
asset.
he
Yes,
saw
yes.
one house which had been given. He says he saw 16 people in this shed.
Yeah.
And then showed a house, the woman showed a house that this is being made for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
You
no,
know?
no, it's huge, Smita.
Yeah.
In fact, and this is where, prematurely one doesn't declare these things, but just because there is Indian women, primarily in the last 10 years, you are seeing they are lifting the society in many ways. In the surge of voters, so even politically and policy-wise, every government is having to respond to women as voters and their aspirations, which did not exist even 15 years back, right? You didn't
Correct.
recognize women as. But now women are a major driver. And I think this is where Prime Minister Modi has this connect. And I think implicitly with leaders who have ears on the ground, they know what is going to lead to transformation of the society. So targeting women for a lot of these benefits are directly leading to not just empowerment of the women, but upliftment of the family as a whole. So you mentioned about little girls, but you see that in the form of height and weight of children, educational attainment of children, right? The house, the family as a whole gets lifted, and therefore society, when you empower women in these different kinds of ways. And of course, we often talk of only Swachh Bharat, and Swachh Bharat also, when we talk about it, it's mostly from health indicators. But one of the biggest unintended consequences, it has reduced assault and crime against women significantly.
Explain, please.
When the toilets were being built in the beginning, the motivation was entirely from a health perspective. That, when you have open defecation, then the fecal matter finds its way into the water, the house, and that leads to neonatal deaths, infant mortality, maternal, and different kinds of morbidities in the household, ailments, different kinds of diseases, waterborne, etc. So let's make India open defecation free. So we started building toilets. I wrote a lot about it in the beginning, but one unintended consequence of the whole thing is that it has reduced assault on women by nearly 22% in rural areas, particularly in the northern belt. It has reduced rapes by a very significant number as well. Now, this is when you think that policies which might be motivated by one objective, and in this case it was health, has lots of unintended consequences also.
So foreign audiences who may not understand why rape and why assault on women is because when there was no toilet inside the house, in rural areas, women had to go towards the forest or towards some kind of a growth where there's, trees and stuff, seclusion, where they can defecate. And that walk was done at 4 a.m. Before sunlight. So it was done at 4 a.m. And when they would go there in groups of 2 or 4, they would get assaulted, raped. So
They're very
these kind of
vulnerable
things,
at that
they
time,
were
yes.
vulnerable.
Yeah.
So just for those who don't understand the socio-economic reasons why these things happen.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But think of the transformation that it is bringing to society, right? Women are safer, and of course they have assets in their names. Like housing is a very major thing. If you look at just what has happened in terms of connectivity of phones, etc., the biggest growth has been in women's access to a lot of these digital technology. No, society, Smita, is getting transformed in ways that if we don't measure it, and that is as a researcher and as someone who wants to inform not just policy, but also society as a whole, because many things bubble up and become political, and that's when it catches. But day-to-day life in India is getting transformed like never before. And we are trying to measure, at least my effort is to try and put a value. Like this one statistics which really shocked me, but very pleasantly, is that, just 10 years back, your bottom 20%, the poorest 20% in the population, only 4% of those people had some kind of a bike or a scooter, some vehicle. Today that number is in excess of 40%. Can you imagine? This is a 900% increase in 10 years. And these are not schemes of the government. The government is doing core things as far as amenities are concerned. But through culmination of all the policies and the growth is also that people are now going out and buying things.
Yeah, cell phones
And bikes and people's lives are getting transformed. So that's why every time people are shocked, I'm saying, we have to just gauge these much faster.
Yeah.
It's very rapid. It's very dynamic. 10 years is a long period of time in a country growing at 7-8%.
Tell me
and
about
a
the
young
labor
country.
force. You were talking about more women in the labor force.
Yeah.
Now, you had said that it had fallen in between, and then there was a rise. Tell me why it rose like that, and was it expected, and have we planned for it?
Right. So I'll tell you, from 2004-5 to 16-17, there is an entire industry. There are lots of papers, lots of scholarly work by researchers from gender, from economics, labor and so on, who have looked at the decline in female labor force participation in India. In fact, I think in the last 10 years, I have personally been lectured by many multilateral institutions, by people from Washington and London and so on, telling us that, it's a matter of great concern and this is something you guys must worry about and so on. But even then, I would always think that, female labor force, it's not a switch. They're reacting to something. These are, right? But then, because there was such confusion about it, 3 months back, I sat down with the data, we sat down with the data, and this is a message I want to give to younger researchers, particularly who look at India. Look at the data, don't listen to experts. 8 years data, Smita, not a single paper to show that there has been a consistent rise in female labor force participation in India from 2016 to 22-23. The growth is fundamentally rural in nature. If you think it's close to 70% growth. So all this decline we have much, we have increased far more. In urban areas, it is around 25% increase. This is all pre-pandemic if you consider the growth had started pre-pandemic. So structurally, major things are happening.
And you're watching it, right?
You're seeing it.
So ye Americans ko kya pata fir?
But we have to be able to
give data.
And this is where we need our own researchers and scholars. And I must say now, there is a group, there are youngsters, there are young assistant professors, associates and so on, who are actually curious. They're not going by what the elders in the room used to say 10 years back. So now people are looking at the data, and that is why many findings that we publish, many people in the older establishment are often spooked. Right? Therefore, they have this kind of a weird reaction to a lot of fundamentally all public data, by the way. Nothing is proprietary.
Where are they? You're saying they're everywhere. They're on factory floors? No.
The women?
The women.
They're everywhere, Smita. And in every state of the country, barring small decrease in Goa and Lakshadweep.
Why?
Why are there decrease in those places? That's a good question. We'll have to look at those places. What has happened?
I would think that in Goa, women are empowered. There'd be more women in the workforce.
I don't think it's really empowerment story. I think many times it is, you see what has happened if you consider the big policies, right? more than 10 crore women have been impacted by the, if you look at the Deen Dayal, the, Upadhyay policy for women through SHG, you're empowering them by giving loan, right? The self-help group. If you consider Drone Didi, Lakhpati Didi, ये सब rural हैं.
Correct.
Right? Then Awas Yojana also, a very large fraction of that has been given to women in rural areas. If you consider almost all these amenity major programs, the targeting has been in the rural, and all of that will culminate into women being freed up from many things and also now have the money through all these schemes to go out and try new things.
Companies will have to figure out, because I remember reading a couple of articles like in tea gardens, they're saying because the women are getting jobs, there's nobody
You
to
will
pick
not
tea
get them.
leaves.
Yes.
BD industry is getting hit क्योंकि BD बनाने के लिए कोई आना नहीं चाहता. They are educated and at least till 8th standard, and then the drone didi, the lakpati didi, all these things, they're getting self-employed. They're getting sewing machines. They've started tailoring units. So BD बनाने के लिए कोई आ नहीं रहा. In agriculture, when it's sowing season, you're not getting, because sowing paddy ke liye women also do that. You're not getting women who are coming. Otherwise, men had anyway left. But women are not coming in. So everybody has to think now that labor participation is going to get hit in some way or the other. And then there are industries who have made their factory floors all women. So that's also happening,
Of course, we need to do more of it. Because these are new phenomenon. If you consider that what is changing in the economy is also changing the society. The women going out and working in hordes or living away from home. That is still a novel, it's a new and not an entirely accepted. So a lot of the cross-state migration that you're having for work, overwhelmingly men. But women are beginning to move for work with the families, let's say.
Yeah. What is it that the government did in the past 10 years? I mean, you spoke about some of the programs like Drone Didi and all. What is the government planning to do for the next 5 years now?
Next 5 years, we want to now focus a great deal on care. And this is where the demographic changes that are happening, we have to now face it the way it exists, which is, one, we are the most populous country in the world, right? Largest in terms of number of people. The second is we are a young country, Smita, but we are also aging. We have 120 million people above the age of 60, which means the need for care. But also from a growth perspective, think of it, the dependent population will begin to grow, right, at this phase. So the population that is working and generating value is going to, as a relative share, be smaller, which means now we also need to grow faster to have resources to take care of all these elders in the future. So growth has to continue, right? That is why we are thinking of demographic transitions much more strategically from the next 50 years perspective. But women are a large part of this demographic transition, right? We are urbanizing very fast. We are also nuclearizing very fast in terms of family. The family as a structure which took care of a lot of work is now increasingly breaking down, right? You have 2 parents and 2 kids. That's an average. Though India has already come below replacement rate in terms of population.
We're going to come to that, yes.
But in urban areas, it's even lower. In fact, urban India has been below replacement rate for the last 20 years. So changes have started. We just have to wake up and understand and shape up accordingly. Women then have a double whammy. I'm getting more educated than ever, right? Indian women. In fact, if you look at STEM graduates, it has the highest. 45% of your STEM graduates are women, highest anywhere in the world. You have sectors like pilot, etc. 18% of your pilots in India are women. Globally, these averages are 5%, 4%. So there are sectors where women, banking, not just leadership, but throughout. You see, there are sectors, women are rising. They're getting more training and education than ever before. But institutionally, we are a traditional, we like children, family, and the role is fundamentally on the backs of women. How are they going to balance this? That's why working women in India have the least amount of leisure time. Less than 30 minutes. They just don't have time, which is leading to all kinds of mental health, stresses and so on. अब वो क्या करेंगी? In an obvious outcome, you're seeing fertility is declining. Right? In many urban parts, particularly of affluent communities and all, fertility is now pretty low. And that is where you are beginning to fear. But how do we want to support someone like this? as a policy, since you asked about policy, we have to build care infrastructure. We have to make daycare and childcare readily and affordable, readily available and affordable. Also, elderly care. We have to, and the government has a major role to play, not just in spending money, but perhaps we also have to think of financial instruments, pension reforms, etc., for the wider citizens, right? If you think of what we have done in insurance, we'll have to think like that in terms of pension. That is number one. Number two, just service in terms of facilities available for care. Then, of course, human resources, the kind of people and the number of people we need who can provide care. That whole training has to keep up with the massive surge in demand that is going to happen in this country.
When do you think this is going to happen, this surge in demand for elder care? Has it already started?
It has started.
It started.
And you're seeing that in some markets. Antara, you're seeing the kind of societies emerge which cater to certain affluent segment of the society.
Yeah.
But nuclearization is happening in all wealth quintiles. It's not a rich family phenomenon.
So housing is going to get impacted.
Housing will get impacted. And so will
smaller
again, financially.
Units and more demand for smaller units.
And affordable housing, and perhaps housing with amenities available for elderly and geriatric care.
Which models should we see? China? Europe?
Not China. Because China, Europe, almost entirely, the state, of course, took on the responsibility. But it's very expensive and it's not sustainable, right? Unlike the US, which has spent all this money but doesn't have much to show for it, which is because it's mostly insurance driven.
Singapore?
And Singapore is a very good model. And I think there are cities within our country which are looking at that model for financing long-term care, etc. But I think the beauty of the Indian economy is that you should think about it as vibrant, many state economies which are experimenting in very different ways of this problem, right? Also, not all our states are faced with the demographic aging problem the same way. Kerala is significantly older than all other states, right? If you think of states like Tamil Nadu and let's say Madhya Pradesh, they have similar population size, but the age profiles are very different. So they will, every state will now begin to address the aging problem differently. Then more fundamentally, is 60 a viable retirement age?
No.
So think of it.
Closer I get to it, the more I feel I'm not ready to retire.
But that's why I'm saying now we have to think of age not just chronologically in terms of number of years, but productivity and biologically.
Yeah.
A 60-year-old today is as productive as, let's say, a 50-year-old was.
Yeah.
Right? And moving forward, we will have to readjust the way we think of retirement and elderly and so on. Also from definitional, which means then, what do you make available?
Yeah. So let me get to that point about which we started earlier with, which I had in the introduction, about what Chandrababu Naidu and MK Stalin have said, asked the people to have more children. And then you had the RSS chief Mohan Bhagwat also saying that Indians should have 3 children. Of course, some people laughed and said, who's going to listen to these people?
Yeah.
We are a generation which grew up on Hum Do Hamare Do.
Yeah.
We heard that slogan. Is that slogan done and dusted with? Why are the chief ministers of these 2 states saying produce more? What are they panicking about, or why have they pressed that button to say that we're going to give more incentives to people who have more children?
Yeah.
It was just the other day that people said that if you have 3 children or more, you won't get a government job. And now the other way around.
The odd thing is that because Chandrababu Naidu and Stalin have said it, we are all talking about it. But churches in Meghalaya have been saying this for decades.
Okay.
That have more children. The larger the family, the more the benefits from the church. There are many dimensions to this, Smita, and I think it's all coming together. And that's why we need to openly talk about these things. I think the chief ministers of the states that you mentioned are talking about it much more from a fiscal federalism, what impact they see or they fear, right? Because these populations in these states are shrinking faster. The northern states, on the other hand, do have higher overall birth rate. So the population growth is not even throughout the country. And it will have bearing on fiscal, whatever.
On politics,
on
everything, if it's delimitation,
everything, right? But at the same time, in society, there are also changes across religions. And as much as our politics is driven by identity and religion, I think when it comes to policy or when it comes to research, there is an effort to paint an economy as a sterile unit where we are all rational agents and identity doesn't matter, right? I mean, where we assume away strip you of any form of identity you might have, which is beyond just a citizen, a rational, thinking, literate. That's not how it works. We are emotional, and culture and traditions make a huge difference. I think some element of this you are going to continue to hear perhaps much more in the future, because the fertility rate of the different religions are different. And of course, the only thing we hear about is that the fertility rates of Muslim population is declining faster. Yes, it is declining faster. That is arithmetically the fact. But that does not change things on the ground. And that is not even the issue. The real concern is shares of population within a district.
But there was this tweet that you had, just bring that tweet. In May 2024, your report, in which you wrote, the Hindu population share declined by 8% between 1950 and 2015, where Muslim share grew by a record 43% during the same period. So you said that it grew. So if the Muslim population grew at a record of 43%, then there's this thing where they say that there's this NGO which said that Population Foundation of India, it said from 1981 to 1991, the Muslim population grew by 32%, but from 2001 to 2011, it dropped to 24%, 24.6%, and the Hindu population growth also the Hindu population's growth rate also decreased, but at a slower pace, going from 22% during 1981 to 91 to 16.8% during 2001 to 2011. So Muslim fertility has seen the sharpest decline in 2 years, whereas yours says that it has increased. So where does the truth lie?
The truth is in the numbers, right? What we estimated in that paper was to show what has happened to India's relative share of different religions. Because the motivation for that paper, Smita, was that, globally India gets beaten down for treatment of its minorities by the global press and also by many intellectuals in the country, right? So the question then to empiricists like me is that let's look at the data. What is happening to minorities as a share of the total population? And I will insist and continue to talk about shares, because eventually in democracy, Smita, it's the shares it's not the absolute numbers by themselves, it's the relative share of different religions that eventually impact either preferences, political preferences, whatever it is outcome that you're interested in, right? I mean, there's a reason you're studying fertility for Muslims and Hindus separately. If everyone were the same, why would you care, right? But we are studying it. And we are studying it because in the last, from 1950, we wanted to see what is happening to relative share of minorities in India vis-a-vis other countries of the world. So it's really a cross-country study for 169 countries. And you see that broadly, 3 set of categories are arising. One is in places like Africa, and this is from 1950. Why do we study 1950? UN system emerged, the whole concept of minority emerged, minority rights emerged, right? Every country has to define. Of course, China doesn't define minority. Many other countries don't define. So that is lesson number 1. We might be the only country which has a cabinet-ranked ministry which looks at minority affairs. And definitions matter because it translates into policy and resources in the way it is spent. So it's important then to study this, objectively. 1950, why 2015? Because that is the time for which most data were available as per this RCS data set. And for India, it was a projection from the last census, right? But 169 countries. What do you find? That in Africa, 22 nations used to be animism. Religion was animism.
Okay.
In 22 countries of Africa. Today, 0. None of them are animists. Because fundamentally they've all converted to Christianity or Islam or actually Christianity or Islam. So conversion is driving a lot of minority the way we define. That's number 1 for many parts of the world. Number 2, in many of the Western European countries, minority shares have increased. Minority shares have increased, largely driven by migration, because the changes are 30%, 35%, right? Massive change, which is not going to happen only through fertility. So open door policies that they have had is driving a lot of this. And we are seeing that, again, it's not just a mechanical, oh, shares have increased, so what? Well, it has direct bearing on the politics, on the way institutions are run, the way you spend money, fiscal policies, etc. You are seeing that in
You're seeing it in Canada, you're seeing it in Europe.
All over Western Europe, there's an upheaval, right? And then when you study our neighborhood, you see that India is more like the Western democracies, the plural democracies, where the share of minority is actually growing. That is the larger lesson from that paper.
But ours is indigenous minorities.
Now, we have to be a bit careful, because when we say India is different from the rest of the region, is because we are the only country where the majority is shrinking and minority as a complex group. Minority includes Muslims, Christians, Jains, Buddhists. And that share is increasing. Then you look at everybody's share, and the paper reports all of that. In India, you are seeing a combination of all factors, Smita. That is when an NGO will go out and say, oh, but the fertility is declining. I'm sorry, fertility is not the only driver. The kind of growth you have seen cannot be sustained only by fertility. So fertility is a factor, and from a public health perspective, we are always watchful of what is happening, because you also want to target, no? Child marriage hai, high risk pregnancies hai. Many of these things have to be targeted, and therefore community level studies or analysis or numbers become very important. But beyond that conversion, the kind of changes you have seen in Tamil Nadu, right? The kind of changes you have seen in most parts of Northeast. Arunachal Pradesh used to be a Buddhist majority till 2001. In 2011, it's a Christian majority, right? If you look at what is happening in Assam, West Bengal, many parts of Western UP, you're seeing Northern Kerala, Southern Karnataka. That's why district level analysis, which we published in EP-257, again, this is all public data. So one is the international analysis, which looks at India and why we are so unique in the neighborhood, because we are more like the plural democracy, which is open. And so there is fertility, which is part of it, differentials in fertility. There is conversion, and there is migration. India has been a refuge to people who have been persecuted in the region from almost all the countries. Not today. We have historically been open to refugees and migrants from almost all the neighboring countries. And it's a culmination of all of this which is leading to these variations in terms of what is happening to minority groups and what has happened to majority in terms of a shrinking majority as a share. So, you know, when somebody comes at an elephant with blindfolded, they will see, oh, fertility is the only problem. So then you will be told, but it is decreasing. I'm sorry. No matter how fast it is decreasing, that does not determine the share. The share is determined by the relative growth of the two. और जब तक growth में फर्क रहेगा, चाहे जो भी level हो, आपका share of one will increase, the share of the other will decrease. That is why politically it is such a hot wire. Politically, when there are talks about whether it's along identity, along religious lines, whether it is along caste lines, whatever those cases be, that is because you have to study these things very accurately. And I find it a bit amusing that for something which is almost, it's a fact of our life in India, why are the research, the intellectuals, particularly of the past, the elders amongst the intellectuals, I don't think it's the youngsters anymore, I think the youngsters are far more pragmatic. There is an ostrich mentality to a lot of this kind of research. Isko nahi dekhenge. In fact, there were editorials written saying, but why is this research important? Why are we looking at this? No, it's important because it's identity. Identity is driving a lot of everyday life in India, right? It is not just the politics. The politics is where it bubbles up.
Yeah.
So it is not the politics of Modi or Rahul Gandhi which is leading to demographic changes on the ground. It is the other way around.
It's like telling history, right? There was a period where certain history which we have gone through in a country was not talked about because it was not looked at.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So when you don't look at it because, it could ruffle feathers.
Yes.
So let's put a lid on it.
Yeah.
You put a lid on it and then it stays shut.
Yeah.
And
festers.
it festers.
Yes.
So, because you are repeating again and again, we need to talk openly.
Yes.
And if data scientists cannot talk openly, cannot research openly, then what are we as a
Yeah.
society?
Yeah.
How are we going to deal with the crises which are
Yes.
going to come
Yes.
up? So, you are seeing a pushback from even academia?
Only academia. And that too from the elders. Right? From by when I say elders, I'm actually being polite. It's mostly from people from the previous establishment who don't want to, look at these data points. They're uncomfortable because they are almost orthogonal, or these are hard facts they don't want to have to face.
But it's happening, right?
Yes,
The
of course
demographic
it is
changes
happening.
which you're saying.
Yes.
The Prime Minister spoke about West Bengal.
Yeah.
And
Jharkhand.
And Jharkhand. We are talking about Tamil Nadu
Yes.
also. So there's a national security implication towards it, internal security also towards it. How are policymakers looking at this now?
Everyone has to, it's not just the policymakers, everyone looks and responds to these changes on the ground in their own way. So first of all, it's important to recognize that politics of today is a reflection of what is happening on the ground. Let's recognize that. Because demographic changes are not, they are glacial, they are really slow, but they're happening. The politics is changing day to day. So let's not even for a while delude ourselves into saying that it's the politics which is driving changes of demography and religion. No, it's the other way around. Every utterance of political leaders, every major campaigns which are raising issues which for you might be bizarre, actually is emerging from the ground because you have instances of those being reported one too many times, right? So this has, from a national security perspective, I perhaps might not even be the right person to talk about national security. Where is the migration problem larger from? And of course, with Bangladesh, we had a porous border for many years. We have had mass migration of Hindus over 4 big waves.
Yeah.
Right? That has affected the entire Northeast. Because that EPW article looks at district-wise changes, and a very large number of districts have seen major change within 10 years. So I'm giving you an underestimate of the changes.
Which you've seen 40 years of change happening.
Yes.
As far as the Northeast and Bangladeshi immigrants are concerned.
Yeah.
But we are seeing that even in elections. I mean, it's like people from Jharkhand say that आप लोग इसलिए अभी समझ रहे हो because it's come out because you reporters have gone into these areas. But we have lived with Jamaitolas.
Yes.
And have you said, what is a Jamaitola?
Yes.
What is that? It was
Yes.
the Bangladeshi migrants who came in. They came into these villages. Then they married girls. But when they were married, they had nowhere to live because you can't live in your in-laws' house.
Right.
So where do these boys go with their newly wedded wives? So outside the main area, like a basti, when I use the word basti, I know how the connotations which come with basti, especially Pakistani viewers will think that because they have the caste system. It's not that. It's just that they were given housing outside the village.
Right.
That, okay, you live here.
Yeah.
They gave them half an acre and said, okay, you cultivate, you grow here, you live here. So the son-in-law went there. But now it's 20 years. That's become a village in itself.
Yeah.
The Jamaitola has become, they've got Aadhaar cards. They're living there.
Yeah.
So these
Also,
demographic
inheritance laws
changes-
across the country.
Yeah.
If you're a woman and the husband actually can inherit. Right?
Yeah.
So no, we have to get into almost anthropological level.
Yeah.
This simple thinking that Delhi often has, or what the armchair experts have. I'm sorry, it has been broken one too many times.
Or the Tibetan refugees
Or
who came in,
Tibetans,
or
yes.
the Afghan refugees
Yes,
who came
absolutely.
in. They have made homes
Yes,
here.
yes.
And Afghan in several waves.
Yeah.
Tibetans also came in a couple of waves.
Right.
But Bangladeshis are coming in wave after
Yes,
wave.
Yes.
We are seeing
it has happened. It has happened.
Rohingyas.
And you are seeing that emerge now as a major issue. But that's understandable. Smita, it's important to realize that many of these issues, if they are not resolved, they don't just go away. Like we said, it festers. And it will come up and manifest in various ways. So many of our institutions are coming under stress.
How do we document them, Shamika? Because we're seeing visuals of police going into bastis and asking for IDs.
Yeah.
Now, if you are an illegal immigrant, the first thing you do is get an ID
Yes.
of some form,
Correct.
right? Getting an an Aadhaar or a PAN card or
Yeah.
whatever.
Right.
You get that. Once you have an ID or local ID, you have mingled and you are living. How do you go through that
So
process?
that is the effort now to as we're getting more digitized, as we're getting more formalized in many ways, we have the means and the capacity to now do identification. If you think of Aadhaar as a digital ID, unique ID, I mean, we have made a huge headway. So that, it's not that difficult in terms of capacity to do it.
But gaming the system is not
Oh, that will
easy.
always remain, and then it becomes a policing issue, but or a law and order, and it's an everyday affair. No, I mean, we have thieves in the society. You have to. So that's. I think you asked about national security. There are many elements to these drastic changes which are also day-to-day law and order, or for instance, how it is impacting housing, right, and there is a normative view of things. Oh, this is how we should be, and this is. But societies don't, and institutions don't work like that. Think of if in 10 years we have seen such major, like 50% increase in population, right? 80% increase in population of our, let's say, Muslim community. It's not a sterile, mechanical happening. It has repercussions on the ground. And when I say it has repercussions on the ground, I'm telling you that there is a reason why when a sitting chief minister will declare that normal policing, sending our patrols, is becoming difficult in certain localities, neighborhoods, Muslim neighborhoods. हमारा तो ऐसा कोई definition नहीं है. We have districts and we have subdivisions and we have police stations.
These are artificial.
ये जो नए, these are concepts which are impacting, is also telling you that basic administration and law and order also get impacted. Then the fact is that, not all communities have similar practices. Communities have different kinds of practices. If you look at the time use survey, that's another paper we had published. People of different religions spend time in collective religious activities very differently.
Okay.
Meaning, how often are groups practicing religion jointly? Now, if you think that does not have bearing on housing or the kind of decisions people make where to live, then, sorry, that's not how the world works. People want to live near and in neighborhoods where there are like-minded people, or there aren't too many obstructions to traffic. When you go to pick up your kid, you don't have to wait for hours because people are praying on the streets, etc. Right? The time use survey is telling you that different communities practice it differently. And, in the Muslim community, people are spending on an average a lot more time in collective activities than, definitely much, much more, multiple of what the Hindu communities are doing it.
So they want to live together because of that. Are you saying that? The ghettoization happens?
Eventually, people resist if there are big impediments to their day-to-day life. And that has bearing on housing decisions or, roads and, the kind of local law and order issues of administration we are thinking. That's why I'm telling you that the reason we look at these kind of things is when you hear certain tensions arise, that if everyone is the same, why should there be a problem? Why is it difficult for one community to find housing in majority other community? Because of these kind of tensions.
So, for example, like when I interviewed the chief minister of a particular state, and I asked him, why do you run the bulldozers in certain areas? And he said, look, the road has to come in that area. It has to pass, the highway has to pass through that area. We have to acquire the land. And then these mafia guys who own the land in those areas, without specifying the religion, he said that they don't allow that. So first you give them notice, they don't listen to that notice, and then what do? You give them the compensation and say, no, the road has to be built. We cannot go around those areas.
Yeah.
So it impacts on various things. If your government has the numbers to go and build it regardless of the pressure tactics of these communities, then you do it. But if you don't have the numbers, and you're a coalition government which is dependent on support from that particular community, then you don't do it. So
Yeah.
road building gets affected. I'm just giving you an example of
no,
a road.
that's a good example.
Yeah.
But what you talked about was from the political side of things. I'm saying from administration,
No, even
running
for-
of a government.
For a citizen like me, for example,
yes.
if I live in a particular area
Yeah.
and a highway is not going to be built because of
People
what I
resist
said,
and-
yeah,
yes.
so it'll impact everybody.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
But that's why in democracies we have institutions. And we have to take recourse to institutions to move in a certain way. But this is where I think...
How? So, for example, Trudeau is now battling with that, right? For the past 10 years, there has been a lot of Chinese migration.
Yes.
They've bought up land, they
Yes.
bought up resources, I mean, flats, everything. So, the people who lived in Canada cannot afford housing. So, the
Yes.
nuclear
Yes.
families, the new families who
Yes.
want to buy a house, they can't afford it.
Yes.
Even with 2 mortgages, you can't afford
Yeah.
an apartment.
Yeah.
So, explain to me how that works.
I think in the Canadian case, Smita, there's a lot of long-term economics that they have taken into account. They wanted the money, they wanted the investments. Now they want human capital. So there is a reason they have opened consulates in places like Tel Aviv and Bangalore. That should tell you what kind of labor they want going forward to finance their pensioners, aging population, and so on. There are economic decisions behind some of these things that these nations have
Yeah.
done. We have to do similar things, but what we also have to realize the magnitude and the complexity of our problem is much more severe.
So these migrants, when they come in, for
Yeah.
example, in the Northeast, they bought shops.
Yes.
So you have, the local population saying we can't afford to buy a shop here because it's been bought by the migrant.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is affecting us too, just like it affected Canada.
Yes.
It's affected us too.
What we have to do though is that, in places like Northeast and all, we also need basic land surveys because in tribal is a black box.
Okay.
Right? So who owns which land? Yes, it is collective, but we know for sure that a collective has also been usurped by elites and are being transacted. That is
Yeah.
not how tribal lands were meant to be. So there is a lot happening, and I'm saying from a policy perspective, we have to open these up and, measure it and get certain things done, which means then taking a view which is pragmatic. We cannot...
But it's a political
wish
hot potato.
it's a political... of course it is. But
Like
in democracy,
in
everything
the Northeast,
eventually... Yes.
you would want an NRC, right? Policymakers would say NRC. Without NRC, how do you do this? You don't have the data.
Yeah.
So without data, how do you enforce any kind of law? How do you make a law firstly?
I think that is where the politics also has the solution, right? Those are the laws we have decided to play by. So you are seeing that politics is getting increasingly
Are you in favor
sensitive.
of an NRC?
Oh, yes, I am.
You are.
No modern plural democracy can function without these basic institutions.
Okay. And how do we go about it? Should we go about it as a national register or should we go by state, leave it to the states?
We have started a effort to create civil registration of vital statistics because you noticed this even during COVID. The measures of death, not from some regions we weren't getting very robust, in terms of credible numbers. But that's because you have really seen in the last 10 years this massive digitization and an effort to measure all births and deaths, meaning give death and birth registrations. And that gradually then expands into Aadhaar-linked some kind of an identification. I'm not saying that has to be the only way. But these are now all being made possible. But it's 1.4 billion people, right? So, and it is done through the local institutions, whether it is through the public health people, whether it's through police. But these are your functionaries on the ground who will go out and identify and make these things. Right?
Shamika, another thing which you were talking about, tribal lands. There are also people who have lived in lands which for hundreds of years, they don't have the papers. When you don't have paper and when you need to do these kind of registration, how do you go about that
This
process?
is not unique to the Northeast, Smita. Many,
Yeah.
Even in the rest of the country, land
Forest
titles,
land. Yeah.
land titles, normal land, field, वो भी titles clear नहीं थे पहले.
Correct.
So in many ways, through the cadastral maps, through the drones, using all these new technology, we are making all that possible today.
Okay.
and giving documents, right? In fact, even for housing and all now, for immovable property, we are in a position, and the government has made a huge initiative. But these are now rolling on the ground everywhere in places, many in the north and the western part. A lot of this has already been mapped. Elsewhere it is happening, but we have to maneuver all these tensions on the ground. But we'll get there, and I think we are getting there already.
Okay. You mentioned in Africa about the conversions, the
Animism.
And now that minorities in
They've
that
disappeared.
tradition, they've disappeared.
Yes.
Are you in favor of an anti-religious conversion law in India? Do you think that's, again, it's a very difficult thing.
It is.
State-wise, it has to
is.
be done.
Yes.
Do you think that that's the way forward for India?
You know, I'll tell you, I used to come at this problem from a individual rights perspective. Belief is something personal. If you feel compelled and attracted to one belief and faith, you should be able to do it. What is happening on the ground, Smita, is very little free will is really getting exercised. And I'll tell you why. Because, and of course, there's an anecdote. I typically don't resort to anecdote, but this was quite a compelling one for me. My driver came back after 3 years. He went out and he was working at one of these major Christian institution here in Delhi. And he came back and he said, I'm looking for a job. Will you hire me? I said, what happened? He said, there were 3 of us there. And we were told, if you convert, we'll make you permanent. Otherwise, we'll let you go. Right? I would be foolish to think that that is a one-off. It's not one-off.
No, it's not.
I have seen so much of it in the Northeast. I've seen so much of it in many parts of
School
tribal
education
areas.
and hostel, yeah.
So I'll tell you, this is where I'm not sure it's free will which is getting exercised. And of the 3 people that this institution had recruited as temporary before they made permanent, 2 converted. Now this guy, he ran away. He didn't want to convert. So therefore he came back to me looking for a job. That just tells you that free will is it's not on the ground the way we think it is. There's a lot of inducement and basically I'll tell you it is, the soul harvesting bit that is happening. I mean, people under distress will do anything to save a child I think this is where how much of it is coercive and what is free will. I think we have to have a very serious discussion in this country. So far we have just pretended it is all free will and therefore let it be in the way it is, right? So I am for having a serious discussion on this and seeing what is the nature of. But if I look at the data of just 10 years from 2001 to 2011, conversion has begun to play a very major role in some of the districts of, whether it's southern Bihar, Jharkhand, Odisha,
Madhya Pradesh,
MP, Punjab. Tamil Nadu. Now,
Karnataka, southern
many
Karnataka.
parts, right? Yeah. These are very drastic changes. And therefore, when we think of population shares and only think of fertility, we are pretending that conversion is not happening. And every person who's converting is doing it under free will and happily. And that is where we think, well, perhaps the state ought to provide many things.
Yeah.
Jiska duress ke karan they are moving. But then I don't think state is the solution to a lot of these things.
Then private sector?
Private sector also. And therefore you also will go into freeing up Hindu temples and having they should have the authority and wherewithal to spend the money they want. I mean, they might want to go out and have campaigns and camps and give people, but they are held back because of multiple governance issues, right? So I think that's why conversion, we have to have a very serious discussion.
Okay.
And not ban it. I don't think conversion should be banned. But we have to know the conditions under which people are being induced.
You spoke about activity which is done together by one community, right? Now there's also housing. In housing, certain housing, they prevent another religion, people from another religion coming and occupying. Now say Singapore, it has this rule that 30% of this, 30% of this and 30% of this ethnic.
Yeah.
So you cannot have an all Indian building or an all Malay building. You have sections like that, but they have very strong rules on this.
It's authoritarian.
Yeah. And they ask you also blatantly, about...
It's not just Singapore. Malaysia has
Many
countries
countries have it.
Yeah.
do you see that happening in India slowly, like society saying that we need a healthy mix, so we need this? Or do you see it the other way around going, that we don't want a healthy mix, we want that ghettoization?
I think from the society itself, you'll have two bifurcated views. And this is where eventually it won't be sustainable.
Okay.
The government will have a view based on the constitution, which is that it has to be equal opportunity to all and it's bound by those rules. So therefore, we at no point want to promote segregation. And I think that's a wonderful thing from the government's perspective, right? You are bound by the constitution. But the private sector, not at all. The private sector will do what people want because that is what they value. They want to live with like people.
Like-minded, yeah.
And so you are going to continue to see these kind of... But there are also counter pressures, Smita. You are seeing extremely affluent gated community where, I mean, it's a mix. So private sector will lead to all kinds of new things. And growth begets its own solutions to long-standing problems.
And you don't see government intervention happening in this?
On religious lines?
Yeah.
Never.
No?
No. Because reservations of any kind is not allowed by religion.
Okay. One thing I wanted to ask you was that, we're seeing all these schemes which are coming in, which either you want to see them as all the Ladki Bahin and the... are they freebies? And if they are freebies, how long will our economy be able to sustain this kind of a thing? There's one view which says that we have to do this because it empowers women, it empowers the people who have been disempowered for so many generations. They have not had. So you need to do all this. Can freebies be sustainable? How is it?
I think we have to make a distinction between what is a freebie, meaning it's a waste of money, we are thinking, right? Eventually, that's why we call it and what exactly is a basic amenity which the state ought to provide, right? In the last 10 years, at least under Modi administration, we have a clarity in terms of basic amenities. And that basket itself is also expanding.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Many things. And you want to make basic fundamental things available to everyone, Smita. Because like electricity, water, right? I mean LPG, phone, bank. Free? No, not free. It will be free because equity concerns are there for a certain group, poor sections, right? Vulnerable sections. But eventually, for sustainability, we will have to think of how to price some of these things. And we do cross-subsidization. Well-off people are paying for...
Of course.
Right? That's the way the economy functions. But I think what has happened is because of this constant elections that we are having, electoral politics is driving a lot of the states and at the state level, that is where this real problem resides. It's becoming whatever it takes to capture the vote this time, which is why I was amused and extremely intrigued by what D.K. Shivakumar said just a month after the state elections, when he said, look, don't expect development because we have given you all this money. The money is gone.
Free
I
bus
think it was incredibly honest of him. I think electorate will also have to wake up to the fact. But I think imagine what is happening as far as a lot of the regional parties are concerned. Right now, they have their backs against the wall. It's, and they're not being innovative and creative enough. It's not that there aren't genuine issues. It's a large country with all kinds. But they're resorting to the kind of cheap politics, which is really ruining the state budgets. You see what happened in Himachal. A perfectly fine state. 5% of the population of the governmentally employed people mobilized and got the pensions reversed.
Yeah.
And such is the power of well-mobilized. I mean, see what has happened in Punjab in the last 20 years, Smita.
Yeah.
Our only state which is actively deindustrializing. When the rest of the country, we want to do Make in India and manufacturing. And this is a state which had a lot of industry.
It's not new. They pushed out Haryana. They said, we don't want you. Make a Punjabi Suba. They pushed out. Who pushes out your industry? This is what...
So what has happened? Now you have seen a complete dehyphenation. Of Punjab and Haryana. You almost never talk about them in the same because today an average Haryanavi is twice as rich as an average Punjabi. And it's a 15-year phenomenon, right? So you are seeing that there are things which are sustainable and then there are the kind of benefits that the state will give which is to buy the votes. But I think we are also honest enough, and I saw that in case of Karnataka, we are beginning to openly talk about it, and the electorate is also beginning to understand that this is just a short-term...
I mean, you saw the difference in the results of 2024. And what happened in the Haryana election. I mean, there were various factors, yes.
Yes.
But and in Maharashtra election. Within 4 months, you saw a reversal of fortunes because the freebies which were given in 2024 or were promised did not have that effect. I mean, various policies, I think, were like, no, we don't believe in this anymore.
No, so that's part of public campaign. I mean, and I think media also has a role there. That educating the electorate. Electorate is very smart. On the whole, they've got the thumb rules, right? Which is why you are seeing some of the sort of outcomes. But, I think political parties have to mature, Smita. In promising by bankrupting cannot be the...
But it's the same promise made by two different parties and how it is processed by people. I saw this in Maharashtra when Shinde was making that promise and 2 installments of that thing had already reached homes.
Right.
And then you saw the Congress making the same promise but increasing the amount.
Right.
This was 1,000 and that was 3,000 or something like that, rupees. That was made. And there were Muslim women who had got that 2 installments, and when they were asked that the Congress is promising almost double, will you go with them? Because the inclination of a Muslim woman would automatically be towards the Congress, right?
No, not always, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, the conventional thinking is that they would not be towards the Shiv Sena or the BJP. So would you go towards that? The reaction was that, and this was several people who were interviewed, the women said that, we do like the Congress, we would move towards the Congress, but 2 installments have come here. And then when they were asked the same promises being made by the Congress and more money, they said, but we have seen what has happened in Karnataka.
Yes.
So they might say 3,000 rupees but not deliver more than 2 installments.
There you go. बिल्कुल, you're right. So this is like मन के लड्डू में घी कम क्यों? कुछ भी बोल दो. I think people are beginning to realize that, but this is a churn that you're seeing in politics, and you're seeing the nature of it even at the center, right?
And in Andhra Pradesh, I noticed many people who was like, we'd be voting for Babu. And I was like, Babu's been out for so long.
Right.
Why are you trusting? No, we want Babu to make what he did with Hyderabad.
Yes.
We want that for
Absolutely.
Andhra
People are
Pradesh.
very smart, and eventually that is why you have so much innate faith in Indian democracy. People will give the right verdict. There is strength in numbers, right? And that is why we have to inform. That is why whenever there is objective truth, what data tells you, you have to bust a lot of these myths.
So when Babu says have more children, rest of the country, the elites were laughing at him. But people in his state were not really laughing. They wanted to know why is he saying this.
Yes.
And if he's saying this, there must be some meaning to it, not blindly because they're educated in the state.
Yes.
They're listening to him. But why is the RSS so worried? Tell me, why
About
would
population?
why is the RSS thinking and saying 3 children? I understand now after listening to you why Stalin is saying it and why Chandrababu Naidu is saying it.
You see, southern states, and this is where now when we think of a nation, the southern states and the kind of problems we're talking for a global level or also for all India level, vis-a-vis neighborhood, etc. Within the country, we have variations across the states, no? So as long as the devolution of fiscal resources is not entirely only tied to population or heavily tied to population, I think the states will be fine. The fear is that because we are relatively fewer in numbers, the northern states will have more heft. Or if it is in the form of course, the delimitation itself, which has to be an extremely scientific exercise therefore, right? But economically, I'm not worried at all. They will always, as is the current case, people from UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, Assam, who will continue to go to Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Andhra to work.
And there'll be demographic changes when they
That shift will happen. And that shift is a healthy shift.
But you're seeing that impacting in various ways in, say, Karnataka, the whole language movement.
Yes.
You've come and you're working here, you're not learning Kannada. It's causing all this language issues.
But Smita, isme I have a little more sort of a nuance. I grew up in Kerala. I read, write, speak Malayalam. My parents are not from there. I think people must learn local language. There must be an effort to at least learn some of it. Ye bilkul, I don't need to, because in my society we are all English speaking and Hindi and so on. I think there's an element of, I mean, that is what, syncretic culture and valuing. And of course, we have a lot of commonalities, even in terms of practices and rituals. But language is an emotive, and I think that effort must be made. So I will not just fault the Kannadigas for saying, bhai, sikho, just learn.
Yeah.
Gotilla is not going to cut it. You have to learn a little bit more, right? But we have also seen that these are not sustainable from a longer term perspective, because Bangalore today is our city, or any place beyond the district, if you see, in the country which has the maximum number of mother tongues spoken, 108.
Oh.
Which means it's so cosmopolitan. People from all over the country are going to Bangalore.
Yeah.
Why are they going there? Because of the economic activities and the kind of job opportunities in future that it promises. And by the way, Bangalore and that Bangalore-Mysore link is cross-subsidizing the rest of Karnataka's livelihood and development.
True.
So I think people also realize that, you can't have too much of anti-North Indians.
And
this, that, and the
RSS
other.
thing that I asked you.
The population, I think that is coming from there is a fear, Smita, with decline in the share of, this is a cross-India phenomenon, declining share of Hindu population. I think some of the fear, and I'm not particularly trying to guess where Mohan Bhagwat's comments are coming from, but as a Hindu, I can see other Hindu leaders fear a declining heft relative to, because in terms of shares. And you should never try and think of it as a declining population fertility rate and hence not a problem. Nahi. Shares depend eventually only when they are equal in their growth rate. And growth is dependent on fertility, but also on conversion and migration.
And I think your study showed that this is what is happening globally, right? That the majority share of majority religious groups declined. Is this the one, that 22%?
Yes.
And in India, it is 7.8%.
Yes, majority has declined. If you look at 1950 to 2015. And I think it's this declining share. Again.
50 to 2015 is global religious trends.
That's the one.
That's your study, yeah.
Yes, and if you look at it district-wise, that is the EPW study, then you are seeing that across almost all districts, there is a declining share in the Hindu population. And that leads to its own sense of fear.
Yeah, okay.
Right? So it's justified.
So as I conclude, I'm going to ask you, farmers' agitation happening, what is your view about MSP for all crops? That's one of the demand that they want. Could it lead to fiscal disaster? Is it possible to have it also?
So Smita, we talked about the changing pattern in terms of consumption, right? People demand for different kinds of food items is shifting. Production has to keep up with that, which means you have to be much more responsive to the market, which means the MSP by itself, while it's a very important instrument, we will have to recalibrate it. Because this rice and wheat production, which basically the foundations are on MSP, those incentives will have to be shifted.
Paddy?
Well, paddy will remain. I mean, these paddy has seen some of the highest growth, largely funded by MSP, supported by MSP. But I'll tell you what is happening on the ground is that farmers in Punjab are buying paddy from Bihar, or wheat from Bihar, and then selling it at an MSP which Punjab is being offered. I think on the ground, we need to rethink the minimum support price.
Also because it's state level subjects.
So that is where the farm laws, I mean, remember as disappointed as we might have been at that point in time, the beauty of this massive federal structure is that states have their own powers to bring in a lot of reforms. So many states have. Many states have already implemented several recommendations of.
Which states have?
Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, Bihar. Bihar has seen one of the most rapid diversification in cropping pattern.
And Andhra Pradesh, when it was a non-BJP led government there, in spite of that, they brought in.
Yes. That's why fisheries in Andhra is doing phenomenally well.
Okay.
Fastest growing sector within agriculture.
Within agriculture. Do you see this dying down, the farmers' agitation, or do you think that they will be able to exert pressure on MSP related demands?
I think that pressure is always there, right? Farmers as a community is a very well organized community. But the important thing to recognize is that farmers are also the backbone of the agriculture sector, Indian economy still has agriculture as a very
How much is
major.
the percentage now in
It's people
dependence?
say 50, 55, but I have my doubts because when I have re-estimated what fraction of India is urban, that number is anywhere between 65 and 70%, Smita.
So how can it be?
It cannot be therefore. So we need to look at some of these
Census
numbers.
needed? Absolutely.
100%, and it will be done because delimitation has to happen before the
How
next
has it
elections.
impacted on your research that we didn't have a census?
Well, it does impact day to day, but I'll tell you what has happened in the process is that because we are so digitized, there are so many alternate data systems that have emerged. Census, of course, census, right? It gives you, but you also have projections, which every census also makes projections for the next 15, 20 years. The point about Indian economy is that we are beating all those projections also. So we were expected to urbanize at a certain rate, but we are urbanizing so much faster. Therefore, I think now, of course, the census is
But also
likely to happen
census
soon.
and data collection in India, it's not a sterile process.
No.
It has interest. So just explain to me how is it done? Just broadly for youngsters. There are many who don't even probably remember. They must have been kids when the last census was done. And so explain the process to me, both your data collection as well as the census data collection.
I only research government data
Okay.
because it is publicly available. And so even within the government administrative data, which is not publicly available, even though I might have access to it, I never analyze and put it out.
Okay.
Because no one can replicate it, Smita. I think the beauty of empirical work is the credibility, because anyone should be able to replicate it and say, oh yeah, what she's saying is right. But not just that. Oh, look what else I found. That is the idea why you do some basic ones. In India, we have an extremely robust, historically very good system of data collection, which is rare for a developing country.
Okay.
Right? Today, of course, now we are an emerging market and now we are middle income. But even when we weren't, we might not have had many other things, but data collection became an institution in itself, right? It is largely done through Home Ministry, which does the census through the Registrar General. And there are many other kinds of data that the Registrar General does. But then we have an entire ministry dedicated to collection and dissemination of data, that is MSP, the Ministry of Statistics and Planning, right? They do many surveys, which are annual surveys, representative not just at the national but state level. Now we are moving to district level estimate, because remember, India is so large that an average district is 2 million people. So it's a huge entity. We need highly decentralized data. Consumption data is collected every 5 years. This time it was 10 years. That's why these kind of studies have revealed such major changes. The periodic labor force survey, in the past regime, you had to wait 5 years to get unemployment numbers. Now, unemployment is a very core macro indicators. Without that, 5 साल का number का मतलब भी क्या होता है?
Yeah.
So now we have made it far more frequent. It's annual, right? Then there are many other kinds of, like you have All India Debt Survey, many kinds of survey which the government conducts, and the data is openly available to everyone.
Okay.
Right? So states have their own data collection, but I think
Do you get access to that?
the states, yes, several
Yes.
states.
Okay.
But I'll tell you, they're not all very good.
Huh.
And that is the next rung of reforms as far as statistical. You've seen there have been several reforms even within MSP in the last couple of years. Much more open. The data is, the quality framework is also being put in place. So we have managed to bring in a lot of new things within MSP. But we need to go beyond the center. The states are very powerful entity and very large entities. And for their own decision making, they need a lot of details at the district level.
So the federal structure that India has, does it impede in any manner the data collection that is done?
Nahi.
No, it doesn't.
No.
Okay.
I'll tell you, every state, of course, capacity of the states are very different. States which have well-run, they have the state capacity to perform many things, health, education.
Yeah.
Not all our states have good district hospitals or good schools, but many of them do now, right? And in places where the capacity is less in these, it's likely to be less also in data collection.
Like, for example, suppose one wants data on inoculation. say in the northeast states, do you get data easily as compared to, say, Maharashtra?
But you don't have to go to Northeast. And for those level, even for inoculation, you have with the ICMR has it, the Health Ministry has it.
Okay.
Right? The National Health, the
So
NFHS,
there are various,
National Family Health Survey, which the ministry does. So we have a lot of public data available
which
through
is
national surveys,
Okay.
which are very large in sample and therefore representative at state
So
levels.
lastly, I have to ask you this, that did you like your life as an academic better or as a government official more?
I like my current job very much because I'm actually using my tools for a larger purpose. I'll tell you, 10 years back when I was a full-time academic, I would write a paper, forget about it. You publish it and then my job is done, you move to the next topic. You taught it occasionally in the class, but that was it. Today, your motivations are that, oh, there is a gap, ये मुझे नहीं पता. मुझे labor force participation का क्या, I don't know. So I have to do, therefore, to plug gaps in my own knowledge or in the knowledge of policymakers or general public. So I find the motivation also extremely encouraging and guiding. But also once it is done, then the number of younger scholars or not so young, they are using it, institutional usage is massive. So I think good data and good research, good analytics, good evidence is extremely powerful.
So when you meet with lawmakers, are they responsive to the data that you give them? Are they, nah, I don't want this?
No, they're always responsive. And I think this is why I am encouraged so much, Smita, because, anecdotes are very powerful. Like, I had a personal experience and I'm now motivated. It's powerful, but everybody has an anecdote. And to your anecdote, I might have an equal and opposite anecdote. So, फिर किस चीज़ में विश्वास करें? And data, therefore, is relatively more objective. That's why every policymaker, lawmaker, minister, the minute they see the data, you know that it has clicked because they now believe and they have seen the problem from a much more credible perspective. So, and this is pertaining to many things. चाहे वो अमेनिटी, क्योंकि सरकार might be saying 100% electrification हो गया, but survey में अगर आया है कि 98% households have got it, now the job is what 2%, let's go and find out.
Yeah.
So there is always a credibility to large data analysis, self-reported data, because different people come at data from different sides. But it's a very powerful medium.
Okay.
Very powerful medium.
Thank you, Shamika, for explaining these very complicated concepts and making us understand what it means for policy initiatives to actually fructify on the ground. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity, Smita.
Thanks. Thank you for watching or listening to this edition of the ANI podcast with Smita Prakash. Do like or subscribe on whichever channel you have seen this or heard this. Namaste. Jai Hind. Click here to watch the previous episodes.